Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Jen Tolentino. I am the Director of Policy and Civic Tech at Rock the Vote, and I am on the Future of California Elections Advisory Committee, and I am super excited to introduce our next speaker, Mindy Romero, who I have had the pleasure of working with for a number of years. She produces amazing research on the youth vote specific to California, which we use regularly in our work at Rock the Vote. So she is the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at the University of California's Price School of Public Policy. She's a well-known political sociologist and specializes in studying patterns of voting and politically underrepresented groups, specifically youth and communities of color across California and the US. She's usually based in Sacramento, so we're super excited that she was able to make the trip down to LA to share her research around vote centers and the first round of Voters' Choice Act elections that have been conducted. So thank you so much, Mindy, for being here, and she will kick it off. Thank you.
Hello, how's everyone doing so far? Great. Some great conversation already this morning. I feel very privileged to be able to be here today to talk about our research, and hopefully that can help inform the rest of the conversations going forward for today. So my name is Mindy Romero, and I direct the California Civic Engagement Project. Formerly, if you've seen our work before, any of you, you may remember a UC Davis logo on our work. We were established at UC Davis, and last July moved over to USC. But still have a lot of great relationships at UC Davis too. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into our research. But first, I'd like to give a little bit of context. So why conduct research around the VCA, right? And we're not the only ones conducting research. It's also going to be a full report coming out from the Secretary of State's office as required by the Voters' Choice Act, the law itself. So first, I guess we can think about it in terms of expectations, great expectations. We also want to make sure we manage those expectations. But going into this most recent election, the first election of the VCA, really going back to the legislative process when the bill was being discussed and debated and eventually passed and signed, there were a lot of different ways that people talked about the benefits of the VCA, right? Depending on your perspective, whether you were an election official, an elected official, community or statewide advocate. Most people talked about the bill, and often the bill was promoted along a number of fronts here, and I'll talk about some of them today. So one was that the VCA, those counties that chose to adopt the VCA, would experience more efficient elections, right? A modernization of their election system, and particularly around the administrative component of the election. That we would have those counties adopting, voters would see more convenient elections, recognizing particularly that California, at least as a whole, I know there are exceptions for LA, as Registrar Logan has already mentioned, but California as a whole has, in the last 15 years or so, voters have been progressively adopting vote by mail and higher rates. So would a model centered around vote by mail also be recognizing that, but still providing many other resources and options for people to vote, those that chose not to use vote by mail. Cost reductions, a hope that it would, at least at administrative level, at the elections office and counties, we would see a cost reduction, if not in the immediate, perhaps over time. And of course, increased turnout. And advocates, community advocates, statewide advocacy groups, we're very hopeful around this component. Again, keeping expectations managed appropriately in a first election cycle or in the first election cycles, but providing essentially the additional options and choice that voters have, a longer period to vote, being able to vote at any vote center. All of those elements lead to eventually, in some form, increased turnout. At the same time, there have also been concerns, right? A lot of great expectations and hope around the bill and the goals around the bill and now the act. But at the same time, concern around making sure that now that we're moving from polling places to vote centers are less numerous. As Registrar Logan said, LA does have its unique exception where it actually is required to have more vote centers for a certain number of voters, and his office has actually gone beyond that required amount correct? And so taking that initiative, and so there will be more, but still a reduction from the number of neighborhood polling places. And questions around access, what would that look like, right? A recognition that the siting process is very, very important, and I think that's what certainly our elections office has recognized here in LA County with the tremendous effort they've put forth in terms of reaching out to communities to get their input. And then also a recognition that there are disparities, differences historically and still today across California in the use of vote by mail by race, ethnicity, age. So our research has shown beginning in 2012 that, for instance, Latinos and young people age 18 to 24 use vote by mail in lower rates than other groups do. So in a model that's potentially shifting, not initially in LA, but the overall model, mailing everybody a vote by mail ballot and hoping that many more people use that. People that still use and at this point use polling places, what does that mean for them? Recognizing that they have that voting pattern. So, and then also recognition that this is the single biggest change that we have seen in our electoral system, right? Even with all of the great expectations, change. We have to educate on change. People have to know that that the change has been made, so we don't inadvertently lose them or confuse them. But also to understand all of those options, they have to understand them to be able to potentially take advantage of them, right? To have that choice, to know that they have choice. So the recognition that this model, and whatever county we're talking about, but of course LA as well, that there will be a significant outreach effort that will need to be made to make sure that we are reaching voters and that they are benefiting, and that we don't inadvertently see any negatives. And our own research also has established that, previous research that we've done that established just not only the educational component, but also relaying to voters, speaking of where they're at in terms of trusting such a significant change, outreaching to them, sharing the message, trusted messengers. It's not just about the nuts and bolts element of it, that there are these changes, X, Y, Z, but it's also why are these changes, understanding the motivations, creating connections with communities, understanding that different communities of color, right, different communities within our state that are as a whole historically disadvantaged can also have differing reactions, right, and differing needs in terms of those outreach messages. Make sense? Okay, that's just background. And then, it's already been addressed, there is a difference in terms of the model for LA, at least till 2024. More vote centers per voter, and not everybody getting a vote by mail ballot automatically, right? But also size and diversity. And this year, I'm addressing this also because the research I'm about to show you, just want to emphasize that it's on the 5 counties that have already adopted, which are all smaller, Sacramento being the largest. So San Mateo, Sacramento, if you don't know, Napa, Nevada, and Madera. And that, so it does not speak and cannot speak to LA. We can learn hopefully from that, but want to point out that LA has its differences, as I just mentioned, but also obviously a very large county, a great degree of diversity, the historic differences in vote by mail use. And at the same time, though, we do have all of you, and we have a registrar's office that is working to get the word out pretty aggressively and pretty organized. Okay, so the 2 cities that I'm going to talk about, I have first addressing that voter turnout question, wondering if and how it will impact turnout. I conducted a study, my center, along with a few other colleagues, which I'll show in a moment, addressing that. If you're interested in this research, you can get it at newelectorateproject.org. And then the second study is on our website, ccp.usc.edu. I'll show these again in a moment as well. And the VCA implementation study funded by the James Irvine Foundation is specifically looking at the implementation aspect. How did implementation go, and hoping to inform 2020 implementation and potentially beyond as well. Okay. So on the voter turnout research. So this is our research team: Eric McGee of PPIC, myself, Laura Daly from CCEP, Thad Kauser from UC San Diego, another UC partnership, and there's the website again. So really simply, and this is going to be ongoing research, the first brief we released last month, the one that you'll find on that website, at the Future of California Elections. And we simply looked at how did reform affect turnout of of different groups in California. So of the total population, but also of underrepresented groups. So the data allowed us to look at was young people age 18 to 24, Latinos and Asian Americans. Unfortunately, we were not able to look at breakout whites or African Americans in that data set. But what can we learn? So if you read that research, you see that it's certainly heavily caveated because it's one election cycle. So you can look descriptively at, you can look at data kind of on its face value descriptively, what are the numbers and compare, and then you can conduct a statistical analysis to see if there is a significance actually there in what you see. And we did that. But first, let me just give you a little bit of background on turnout rates. This is a really savvy group. You probably already know all this, but in the November general election, and this is eligible voter turnout, just to define that so we're all on the same page, we define that as the percent of those that are eligible to vote that voted, and eligible as citizen voting age or adult citizens, whether they're registered or not. So it's not registered voter turnout, it's eligible voter turnout. With me? And we prefer this, and typically use this measure, a number of reasons, but probably most importantly is because there are, of course, significant disparities in voter registration rates, right? By race, ethnicity, and so forth. So in November, and these are our data, they're just slightly, in some places, slightly different than the Secretary of State's numbers. 50% eligible voter turnout rate for the total, about 36 for Latino population, again, eligible. Asian Americans, 33%, and then youth, regardless of race, ethnicity, age 18 to 24, as we define it, 27.5%. In parentheses are the numbers for LA, if you're interested. 49, of course, LA greatly impacts the overall state numbers, as I know Dean knows. But I just wanted to point out that youth number, 30%, right? Above, and also the Latino number, above the state. There's lots of different ways, this is not a voter turnout talk. I give lots of presentations on voter turnout research, generally by election. But I did want to emphasize one thing. So I'm going to be talking about the increase in 2018 over 2014 VCA counties. If you're interested in LA, there's something really notable. LA had the highest increase, percentage point increase, for the total population, fourth highest for the total population and for Asian Americans, and highest for Latinos amongst counties. So of all counties, when you look at their percentage point increase from 2014 to 2018, by county, Latinos had the highest percentage point increase in turnout, of eligible turnout. So I imagine some of that, this type of analysis, we can't make a causal connection, but I imagine some of that has something to do with all of you in this room, right? So I wanted to point that out. Pretty exciting numbers, and we often, of course, don't see higher numbers in LA. So, all right. So now let's talk about VCA counties and that turnout specifically of, did we see higher turnout in VCA counties? So these numbers are slightly different if you do some math on the screen, just because we have a slightly different data set. But the eligible voter turnout rate for VCA counties combined, those five, is 57%. Non-VCA counties is 52%. Of course, they saw a big increase, as the whole state saw a big increase. If you didn't know that in the November election, it was the highest turnout rate, right, since 1982. And as a whole, VCA counties saw an 18 percentage point increase over 2014, right, in eligible turnout. Now, when you just look at this, higher turnout, right, than non-VCA counties, right, 57 to 52. Very high over 2014 sounds pretty good, but we just want to make sure that we're comparing appropriately. It's not that it isn't good, but we want to make sure we're comparing appropriately. So first off, as a whole, the VCA counties have had historically higher turnout than non-VCA counties, right? So if you just say, oh, they had higher turnout, then, well, we would expect higher turnout, right? The fact that they had such a high increase, that's great, but we also know that everybody had a high increase. So what you need to do is to compare their increase, right, over non-VCA counties. So did they have a higher increase over VCA counties? And does that statistically hold in only one election, which is, again, difficult with that low of a sample size, so to speak. So let's just focus on the top first two lines here. So where the arrow is, that's that 18 percentage point, right, increase over 2014, right, to 2018 for VCA counties. 15 percentage point increase for non-VCA counties. 3 percentage point difference, right? And if we look for young voters, again, age 18 to 24, now the left is general, the right is primary. We'll just focus on general, but almost 17 versus 10, VCA, non-VCA, almost a 7 percentage point difference, right? Higher increase for VCA counties versus non-VCA counties. With me? I have a lot to show you today. I'm going to go fast, so hopefully I don't lose any of you. Again, you can get this online too, and I'm happy to field any questions today or later. Latino voters. So 16 versus 12, VCA, non-VCA, 3.8, 4 percentage points difference, right, between those two types of counties. Asian Americans, 4 percentage point difference. Here, we're much more cautious, though, in our research, both actually for Latinos and Asian Americans, because particularly for Asian Americans, the sample sizes in these counties are very small, and small changes can actually, there can be big fluctuations over time in given elections. So we're not as confident in the results statistically, but we talk about those challenges, but we still present them. Okay, so just going through this. So the Voters' Choice Act increased turnout, again, descriptively looking straight at the numbers, and also when we conducted an analysis. In that analysis, we also controlled, I should mention, for the competitiveness, if I can talk today, of the election. So that's at the congressional district level as well as the legislative districts. We also controlled for the party vote, Democratic districts that were Democratic had higher turnout increases than Republican districts, if you didn't know that. Let's see here. So VCA effect for subgroups vary. This is basically the numbers that I just gave you. They're percentage point, not percentage, but to make it shorter on the screen. The first number in each parentheses is the general, then that's the second is the primary, should be. Okay, so, and then we also did, historically look back and also accounted for historical trends starting in 2002, which was the data year that was available to us. Okay. And here's key. So if you see here for both the total population increase as well as for young people, statistically, it was a pretty solid effect. We're pretty comfortable in the degree of significance. For Latinos, a little less so, call it a modest. And for Asian Americans, much less so. We report them, we talk about those differences. We want to note them, and then we'll compare them going forward, if that makes sense. What we did find is we feel really comfortable and confident in the fact that there was no negative effect. So an effect, pretty comfortable and confident in that for total voters, for young voters, we'll have to see going forward if this holds for Latinos and Asian Americans when we have more counties to add to the analysis. But it is strong enough for us to be pretty comfortable that there wasn't a negative effect. And that was an open question for some folks. Would the VCA potentially produce that? So again, this is for these 5 counties. And now going into 2020, we're talking about very diverse counties and very large counties like LA and Orange. So we'll be looking to see what those data produce. Okay. Oh, and the other thing I want to mention too, one of our future looks will be at the representation question. So you can increase turnout. So we have some evidence to suggest that there is an increase in turnout. That's a good thing. But there's always the representation question. Were gaps between groups, right? Those gaps I just showed you a moment ago, just in 2018 alone, right? Between the total, between Latinos, between young people. Did the representation gap? And I want to make sure I keep that on your minds. It's something we should all be thinking about, right? Any type of election reform. And we still need to do further research and gather further data to be able to look at the representation question. So it looks like all groups increased, it's statistically significant, didn't have a negative effect, but the representation question is still out there for researchers. Okay, key considerations for implementation. So this brief also was released last month at the Future of California Elections. Also was invited, thank you very much, by the Secretary of State's office to present it at the debrief on the VCA the next day. I'm going to talk about this brief and one other brief that's being released next week. So let me tell you a little bit about the study. So this is an extensive study looking at specifically how the VCA was implemented, again, in these first 5 adopting counties. The goal is to, with this research, to inform counties that are making decisions around adoption, their implementation process to hopefully produce even more effective implementation, and in 2020 or potentially beyond. And certainly counties that have already adopted, as much as this can be helpful for them. There's that website again. The Study Advisory Committee, we're very fortunate to have a really robust committee, and I just want to give an acknowledgement to Registrar Logan, who's a member of our advisory committee on this study, and Astrid, who is not here today, but is also a member of our advisory committee. Oh, and actually James, I saw James is a member of our advisory committee. Hopefully I haven't missed anybody else. Okay. So we conducted 40 confidential in-depth interviews with election officials from VCA and non-adopting VCA counties, statewide advocacy groups, community groups, and other stakeholders that have been involved in VCA implementation in some way in 2018. We also did focus groups, social media analysis surveys. Our partners at UC Riverside, who partners with us on the first brief, we co-branded the first brief that was released last month. They conducted the social media analysis and the survey. And okay, so here are even though they're not released yet, all of them, these are all the briefs that are coming. I just want to make sure you're all aware of this. We have a project page, so you don't have to have 5 or 6 different links. You can continue to check that project page if you're interested, and you'll see them populated as they're released. And hopefully we can maybe get them out through the Future of California Elections Network at some point. So the first brief I'm going to talk about in a moment. The second one is on collaboration specifically, and I'll also give some highlights on that. It's not yet released. And know that there's also a brief on EAP process, vote center siting process, outreach and education, and successful factors, or factors for success. Okay, so on this first brief, there's 2 research questions. I'm going to focus on the second one today because of time. So, and this first brief looks specifically from the perspective of election officials. All of the other briefs, the topics I just showed you, give all the perspectives of both election officials and community advocates, everybody that were part of the research project and the data collection. This one is from the perspective of election officials telling their colleagues things that they should be considering when they're thinking about adopting to see a successful adoption. Thank you. So let's dive into that. So here, and again, these are just highlights, but the suggestions we heard was to understand the significant investment of time and resources that it's going to take if you adopt the VCA, preparation of election operations, the significant collaboration and what that all entails with stakeholders, and also that putting the voter experience first is going to have to be absolutely paramount. And it's not a simple thing, but it's going to be paramount in seeing a successful collaboration, paramount in your conversations and in your decision-making process about whether you want to adopt, period. So I was asked to focus just on what's probably most relevant to coalition and community engagement today. So know that that's what I'm focusing on, but there's lots more obviously in the brief. So we heard from election officials that it takes a lot of time to involve community partners in the implementation process as it's required and outlined in the VCA. That includes community engagement, not just in the voter outreach phase, but in the early phases, right? In the EAP planning process as well. How important that is. And whether it was important or not, just how much it takes to be able to do that, right? And of course it is important. One VCA election official advised other counties to have, quote, a clear expectation of the time and resources that are needed to do the level of stakeholder engagement that is both required in the VCA and what's really necessarily specific for your own community, to understand that. Every election official from VCA counties identified the benefits of robust engagement beyond only meeting, beyond just VAC and LACs, which are very important to establish and required to establish, but beyond that. That's a point that was emphasized often. One election official described the benefits to working effectively with community and advocacy groups, advising others to, quote, make sure they get everybody on board that they can, whether it's advocacy groups or agencies out there that can help them, whatever it is, get them on board because they'll help advertise, they'll help get the word out. This is how elections are now, right, are going to be now, and that will help make it successful. However, we also heard from a number of election officials a recognition that this level of engagement is typically new for election officials. And there's a certain learning curve often for election officials, not necessarily just at the leadership at the top level, but also for staff as well, right, that are engaging in this. That gaining the skills to do this engagement, right, to do it successfully and to do it in a meaningful way, and to do it in a way that seems sincere for community groups as well, really it's beyond just time and resources, it takes a really high level of commitment. And that registrars that had this high level of commitment are going to be much more successful. They're telling their colleagues that, right? If you don't have this, One election official noted that colleagues considering implementation will need to be open to a much higher level of engagement, particularly working around their communities. Okay, so now understanding the voter experience, as I heard, we learned a lot and heard a lot about this from election officials. So several election officials noted their concern over the long lines, and I know that's already been mentioned here today too, at some vote centers, and primarily where there were long lines, that was on election day, typically later in the day, at both the primary and general election days in BCA counties. So improvements to be made to vote center operations, acknowledging that there are improvements to be made, so that long lines don't potentially discourage would-be voters, right? Either to enter the line, either getting out of the line before they've completed, or maybe that experience potentially impacting them in their future likelihood of voting. But also that when we talk about the impact of lines, we have to talk about it in terms of voters' expectations, and those expectations can be managed. They can vary across voters and voter groups and counties, and they also can potentially be managed, is what we heard. So, quote, "This issue is again managing voter expectations and voter use of the vote centers. It's successful that we have long lines, unfortunately, and here in this case, the interview was meaning that a lot of people were coming out to vote, right? It would be nice if we could manage the success by getting some of these people into the process earlier." And here this person meant using those earlier days, right, up to 11 days, as opposed to coming in on election day or close to election day. CVR on election day was one cause, processing CVR, conditional voter registration, same-day voter registrations, one cause of long lines at some vote centers. So to begin to address this, if you didn't know, I know that LA County, of course, is thinking about this, but at a statewide level, the California Association of Clerks and Elected Officials, the CACO, which is a professional body of election officials and clerks, has recently established a line busting committee. So recognizing, right, that this is an important issue. So as one election official said, if there are lines happening at a vote center, then that's not success. It's for vote center and non-BCA counties to figure out how we can, for that Monday and Tuesday, handle the potentially huge number of voters that either want to change their registration or want to newly register to vote. So some key themes around voter experience that we heard. So a positive voter experience entails, again, from election officials, efficient vote center operational logistics, so people can get in and out, they can get checked in a timely way, the flow through the center, there's enough machines, nothing's breaking down, the Wi-Fi is working, all sorts of things, right? The reduction of long lines specifically, and robust, aggressive voter outreach efforts. To increase voters' awareness, the outreach efforts are to increase voters' awareness and ensure successful use of vote services on election day or before election day. Again, people need to be aware of this, right, to be able to use the choices that are available to them. And that collaborating with community groups is absolutely vital to that process, to getting the word out. And what we also heard is, again, the voter experience itself. Do they come, do they show up, do they turn out, but also what, after they leave, what are they left with, right? Was there confusion? Was there not confusion, but still was the experience what they might have expected or what was intended? So while the VCA was intended to positively enhance voters' experiences, as we've talked about today, through more choices, more services, there was a recognition by election officials that it has the potential to inconvenience some voters, such as with long lines or lack of understanding, confusion, right? Not knowing, maybe going to their old polling place, for instance, and not knowing about the change and having to move around, as one example. A commitment by election officials to invest. So we heard from election officials saying that a commitment to invest in a realistic and sufficient allocation of resources in both administrative and collaborative outreach, right, was absolutely positive if we're prioritizing the voters having a positive experience under this new system. So now I'm going to move over to the second brief, which we haven't released. So I'm just going to touch on a few highlights here. We want to respect the fact that it's still going through our advisory committee process and all of that, but I know it's valuable to share some of it with you today. So just briefly, so again, as a reminder, the second brief coming out next week is from perspective of also advocates. And today I'm going to largely focus on just advocates, since I have to give you only highlights. Two main research questions are: how did collaboration amongst various stakeholders influence the VCA process, and what are the key challenges to collaborating? So know that that's both in there. It's actually a really long, really rich brief. I think many of you might be interested in it. Hopefully it might be useful for your efforts. But I'm just going to talk about the first question from the perspective of community advocates. Make sense? Okay, again, I'm going to breeze through this because my time's almost up. So talking about leveraging, community advocates leveraging their combined resources and relationships, the benefits of coming together. So the groups that we interviewed, folks that we interviewed, suggested a number of elements that they say make coalitions impactful, right, during the implementation process. These include relationship building, logistical and creative improvements, coming together to be creative, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and leveraging resources and expertise of the VCA, which I won't talk about today because you're going to hear a lot about that as today, but know that that's also in the brief. So under relationship building, just a recognition and an emphasis that stronger relationships allow a broader range of voter education and outreach efforts to ultimately, right, reach communities that often don't get reached, right, to collaborate on that, to understand, to develop strategies. And that by bringing folks together, there was also a recognition that it's really important to reach out to groups that don't normally maybe do voter engagement, to move beyond that. And the coalition has the ability to do that and also should emphasize that as an important goal, to reach out to groups that might be nonprofits, community-based organizations that have those key relationships, that are working in their communities, that have issues to talk about, right, with their community, and are important networks to get out the word around these changes. Okay, as one member described, we had something absolutely wonderful that came out of the coalition, and will still be coming out of this coalition. That is working with our communities, with our different skills, our different needs, working together in, I think, a way that we've never been able to do before. We heard from some coalitions the added value, right, even beyond the VCA work, in the future, those additional relationships and connections that were made that came from the work that they did around the VCA. Many saw the important benefits from community collaboration efforts. So some of those were closer coordination of outreach efforts with administrative work, so working with the county on those outreach efforts to strategize, to learn both ways and have an open line of communication, but also actually input or impact the work that's actually being done at the county level as well. Faster turnaround on educational materials, sharing those materials, sharing them with the county, but also amongst themselves, right? Not reinventing the wheel, and also getting input on what that should look like for each, sub-community within a county, if you will. And an infusion of community level expertise into outreach efforts, particularly a large emphasis on the need for non-English speaking populations. And there was a recognition amongst those that we talked to that could be done more. There was not enough recognition around, there was a lot of room to grow in terms of reaching out to non-English speaking communities. And the members of your community, who are the members of your coalition, can have a big part of this, right? Getting that representation in your coalition. Under logistical and creative improvements, so there was a recognition that through collaboration, you share creative ideas, create better educational materials, avoid logistical redundancies, and leverage the resources. So not just of the VCC, Voters' Choice, but also of connecting with the Secretary of State's office, connecting with other counties as well, in learning about what happened and what's been known thus far around the VCA. The diversity of the coalition members also enables community efforts to be tailored, right, to specific populations. As one advocate that we interviewed stated, just having a team where you can call up the right person for the right issue and speaking with that authority made all the difference. And they talked about leveraging their collective power to quickly address issues. So here, quote, monitoring this as a collective rather than as individuals made all the difference so we can learn about issues that arose as quickly as possible, so sharing information about those issues across the county. And then instead of addressing it as individuals coming to the county offices, we could go through it as a group. If need be, we could go to the Board of Supervisors, try to get them involved. That made all the impact when they have that kind of show of force from a diverse range of voices, right? A recognition around that. And then just a couple of slides here, if my timekeeper will indulge me, talking about outcomes. So we also heard from interviewees that they were able to influence, they believe, the outcomes along a variety of dimensions. So influence on education and outreach, I've talked a little bit about that. Influence specifically on vote center and drop box administration, both the placement, but also how those function and work, right? Even things like asking and requesting that ballots be collected outside a vote center right, to eliminate what we're being seen early on as lines, people lining up to just drop off their vote by mail ballot. Oversight, and then a general sense that they were able to accomplish or have an influence to some degree on the overall implementation process, an oversight influence. So collaborating with not only themselves, but with their election officials, they were able to better meet their community needs, and they were able to work to stay on top of implementation plans, contacting county offices to address gaps and discrepancies. That particularly was also a benefit of working with the VCC, having that connected network across the state. Also having the materials and knowledge and know-how that the VCC members, both officially as an entity, but also members individually that would connect, that are members of the VCC steering committee, that allowed folks to understand better what gaps and discrepancies they were experiencing that they may not have necessarily noticed themselves, and be able to create strategies around that at a county level. And as one coalition interviewee noted, I think it's all about strength in numbers. The nonprofit industry is a big footprint in terms of the people we serve, and also our staff and what we contribute locally. And so I think we really are able to influence the way that the plan was developed, and ultimately the way that the election was administered. And that's it. Thank you very much.